The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, where heat waves danced like ghosts above the cracked earth. Sam McKinnon pulled his weathered hat lower over his dark hair, squinting. Against the harsh glare as his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle, picked her way carefully through the rocky terrain. At 42, Sam had spent more than half his life in the saddle, and his weathered face bore the map of countless seasons under the unforgiving western sky. The silence that surrounded him was his preferred companion. After losing his voice to an Apache arrow that had grazed his throat 8 years prior, Sam had learned to communicate through gestures, expressions, and the quiet understanding that came from years of solitude. His damaged vocal cords could barely manage a whisper, so he chose silence instead, finding peace in the wordless conversations between man and nature. Before we continue this powerful story of an unexpected rescue and the bonds that form in the wilderness, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Your support brings more frontier stories to life. It was the sound that broke through his reverie, a sound so out of place in the vast emptiness that it made Belle's ears prick forward with alert concern. Crying, the unmistakable sound of a child sobbing, carried on the dry wind like a prayer for mercy. Sam's weathered hands tightened on the reins as he guided Belle toward the source of the sound, his keen eyes scanning the landscape of sagebrush and scattered boulders. There, huddled beneath the meager shade of a dying cottonwood tree, was a boy no more than 8 years old. His clothes, once probably fine city attire, were torn and dusty, his face streaked with tears and dirt. The child's dark hair was matted with sweat, and his small frame shook with exhaustion and fear. Sam dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, understanding that a frightened child might bolt like a spooked deer. The boy looked up with wide, brown eyes that held depths of terror Sam recognized from his own childhood memories of being lost and alone. "Mister," the child whispered, his voice cracked from crying and thirst, "I can't find my papa. We was travelin' with the wagon train, and I went chassin' after a rabbit, and now—" His words dissolved into fresh tears. Sam knelt slowly beside the boy, pulling his canteen from his belt. The water was warm but clean, and he offered it with gentle patience, watching as the child drank greedily. Sam's mind was already working, calculating distances and possibilities. Wagon trains followed predictable routes, but in this vast wilderness, a child could wander for days without finding his way back to safety. "What's your name, son?" Sam managed to whisper, the words barely audible but filled with kindness. "Tommy," the boy replied, wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve. "Tommy Fletcher. My papa's name is Joseph Fletcher. We was going to California to start a farm." The hope in the child's eyes as he looked up at Sam was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Sam nodded and pointed to himself, then to Tommy, making a gesture that encompassed them both moving together. Even without words, his meaning was clear. "I'll help you find your family." The relief that washed over Tommy's face was immediate and profound, as if the appearance of this silent guardian had lifted the weight of the world from his small shoulders. Standing slowly, Sam helped Tommy to his feet, noting the child's exhaustion, and the blisters on his small feet where his good shoes had rubbed raw against the unforgiving ground. Without hesitation, Sam lifted the boy and settled him on Belle's back, then swung up behind him. The horse, accustomed to her master's compassionate nature, accepted the additional passenger without complaint. As they began to move across the desert landscape, Sam's experienced eyes read the land like a book written in dust and stone. Wagon. Train ruts were still visible in places where the wind hadn't yet erased them, and he could tell they were perhaps a day old. The tracks led generally northwest, toward the established trail that would eventually connect with the California route. Tommy leaned back against Sam's chest, finally allowing himself to relax for the first time since becoming lost. "Are you gonna help me find my papa?" he asked quietly. Sam nodded firmly, one arm circling the boy protectively, while the other guided Belle through the increasingly difficult terrain. In his heart, he felt something awakening that had been dormant for years. A sense of purpose beyond mere survival. A reason to care about something other than the endless cycle of dawn and dusk that had marked his solitary existence. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky as they rode, and Sam knew they had precious little time before darkness would make tracking impossible. But for the first time in years, he wasn't riding alone, and the responsibility of the young life depending on him gave new meaning to every mile they covered. Behind them, their tracks in the dust told the story of an unlikely partnership born from desperation and kindness, while ahead lay the uncertain promise of reunion and hope. As the afternoon wore on, Tommy began to share fragments of his story. His family had left Missouri 3 months ago, part of a small wagon train heading to California, where his uncle had promised them work on his ranch. The journey had been harder than anyone expected, with broken wheels, sick oxen, and the constant fear of Indian attacks that seemed to lurk behind every hill and around every bend in the trail. "Papa says California's going to be different," Tommy said, his voice growing stronger as his trust in Sam deepened. "Says there's orange trees and land so good you can grow anything. Mama, she's been sick since we left Independence, and Papa thinks the warm weather will help her get better." Sam listened to every word, understanding that the boy's chatter was as much about maintaining hope as it was about sharing information. In Tommy's innocent description of his family's dreams, Sam heard echoes of his own younger self, full of optimism about what the frontier might offer to those brave enough to seek it. That optimism had been beaten out of him by years of hardship, violence, and loss. But listening to Tommy speak about the future with such certainty made something long buried in Sam's heart stir to life again. Chapter 2. The Trail the First. Night on the trail tested both man and boy in ways neither had anticipated. Sam made camp in a sheltered alcove between 2 large boulders, choosing a spot that would protect them from the wind and provide concealment from any hostile eyes that might be watching the darkness. Tommy huddled close to the small fire Sam had built, his city-bred sensibilities struggling with the vast emptiness that surrounded them like a living thing. "How do you know which way to go?" Tommy asked, his voice small in the immensity of the night. Above them, stars blazed with an intensity that city dwellers never witnessed, creating a canopy of light that seemed both beautiful and threatening to the frightened child. Sam pointed to the North Star, then traced the wagon ruts they'd been following with his finger. He pulled out a piece of charcoal from the fire and drew a simple map in the dirt, wagon wheels, a trail, and stick figures representing Tommy's family. His weathered hands moved with careful precision, creating a visual language that bridged the gap between his silence and the boy's need for understanding. "You really think we'll find them?" Tommy's question carried the weight of a child's absolute dependence on adult promises. Sam met his eyes directly and nodded with such conviction that Tommy felt his first real spark of hope since becoming lost. The night sounds of the desert created a symphony of life that most travelers found unsettling, but Sam had learned long ago to read the meaning behind every cricket's chirp and coyote's howl. When the sounds stopped abruptly around midnight, he knew they were no longer alone. His hand moved slowly to the rifle beside his bedroll, while his eyes scanned the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. 3 Apache warriors materialized from the shadows like spirits given form, their painted faces and silent movements speaking of years spent perfecting the art of invisible approach. Sam remained perfectly still, knowing that any sudden movement would likely result in death for both him and Tommy. The lead warrior, A man of perhaps 30, with intricate tattoos covering his arms, studied Sam with intelligent eyes that missed. Nothing. Words were exchanged in Apache, too quick and quiet for Sam to follow, but he understood the gist from their gestures and expressions. They were curious about the white man traveling alone with a child, wondering if he posed a threat or might have something of value worth taking. Sam slowly reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small pouch of tobacco, offering it to the lead warrior with a respectful nod. The Apache accepted the gift and spoke briefly to his companions before melting back into the darkness as silently as they had appeared. Tommy, who had been frozen with terror throughout the entire encounter, finally released the breath he'd been holding. Were they gonna hurt us? He whispered. Sam shook his head and gestured toward the stars, indicating that the Apache were simply passing through, curious about the unusual travelers, but not hostile. In truth, he knew their survival had depended on a dozen factors beyond his control, but there was no point in sharing that knowledge with a frightened child. As dawn broke over the desert landscape, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they resumed their journey. Sam had given Tommy his spare shirt to protect the boy's arms from the sun, and he'd fashioned a makeshift hat from his bandana. Belle carried them steadily forward, her experienced gait eating up the miles while conserving energy for the long journey ahead. By midday, they encountered their first significant obstacle. The wagon trail they'd been following split into 3 different paths, each heading in a slightly different direction. Sam dismounted and examined the ground carefully, reading the story written in wheel ruts, hoof prints, and scattered debris. One trail showed signs of recent passage. A broken wheel spoke, fresh horse droppings, and the distinctive pattern of a wagon with a loose wheel that left a characteristic wobble in its tracks. That one, Tommy said suddenly, pointing to the middle trail. Papa's wagon had a wobbly wheel. He kept saying he was going to fix it when we got to the next town. Sam looked at the boy with new respect, realizing that even children could be valuable observers when their survival depended on attention to detail. They followed the middle trail for several hours, the heat becoming increasingly oppressive as the sun reached its zenith. Tommy began to show signs of heat exhaustion, despite Sam's efforts to keep him hydrated and protected. When they reached a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, Sam called a halt, recognizing the need for rest and the opportunity to water. Belle, while Tommy splashed in the shallow creek, reveling in the cool water against his sunburned skin, Sam discovered something that made his heart race with excitement. Fresh wagon tracks led down to the creek's edge, and among them were the clear impressions of the wobbly wheel they'd been following. But more importantly, he found a child's toy, a small wooden horse carved from pine, half buried in the sand near the water's edge. "Tommy," Sam whispered urgently, holding up the toy. The boy's face lit up with recognition. "That's mine. I dropped it when we was watering the horses yesterday morning." His excitement was infectious, and even Sam felt a surge of hope. They were closer than he dared to hope, perhaps only hours behind the wagon train, but their celebration was short-lived. As they prepared to resume their journey, Sam noticed something that made his blood run cold. Mixed in with the wagon tracks were the unshod hoofprints of Indian ponies, and they were fresh, very fresh. Apache raiders had been tracking the wagon train, and from the number of prints Sam could count, there were at least a dozen warriors in the raiding party. Sam's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. He could turn back, taking Tommy to the nearest settlement, and leaving the boy's family to whatever fate awaited them. He could continue forward, potentially riding into an ambush that would doom them both. Or he could try to reach the wagon train ahead of the Apache, warning them of the danger while reuniting Tommy with his family. Looking down at Tommy's trusting face, Sam knew there was really only one choice. He helped the boy back onto Belle and pointed northwest. following the trail that led toward an uncertain confrontation with danger and destiny. "Are we going to catch up to Papa today?" Tommy asked, sensing the change in Sam's demeanor. Sam nodded, but his weathered face was grim with the knowledge of what might lie ahead. In the distance, a thin column of smoke rose against the blue sky, and Sam's experienced eyes recognized it immediately. Not the controlled smoke of a campfire, but a black, oily smoke of burning wagons. They were too late to prevent whatever had happened, but perhaps not too late to help with whatever came after. Chapter 3. The Smoke. The scene that greeted them was worse than Sam's worst fears had prepared him for. The wagon train. 5 wagons that had carried hope and dreams toward California's promise lay scattered across a small meadow like broken toys discarded by an angry child. Smoke still rose from the smoldering remains of canvas covers and scattered belongings, while the acrid smell of destruction hung heavy in the still air. Sam quickly covered Tommy's eyes, but not before the boy had seen enough to understand the magnitude of the tragedy that had befallen his family's traveling companions. "Papa?" Tommy whispered, his voice breaking with terror and disbelief. Sam dismounted carefully, leaving Tommy on Bell while he surveyed the devastation with the practiced eye of a man who had witnessed too much violence in his lifetime. The attack had been swift and brutal, but as he moved through the wreckage, he began to piece together a story that offered a glimmer of hope amid the horror. The defensive positioning of the wagons suggested the travelers had some warning of the attack. Personal belongings were scattered, but not in the random pattern of complete surprise. Rather, they showed signs of deliberate abandonment, as if people had grabbed what they could carry and fled. Most importantly, Sam found very little blood and no bodies, which meant the majority of the wagon train's members had likely escaped the initial assault. "Stay with Belle," Sam whispered to Tommy, his damaged voice barely audible but carrying unmistakable authority. He began following the tracks that led away from the destroyed camp, his experienced eyes reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken vegetation. What he found renewed his hope. The tracks showed a group of people, men, women, and children, moving together in an organized retreat toward a series of rocky hills about 2 miles northwest of the destroyed wagons. The Apache raiders had followed them partway, but then turned back, possibly deterred by the defensive advantages the hills would offer to determined defenders. Among the scattered belongings, Sam found items that clearly belonged to Tommy's family. A woman's bonnet that Tommy identified as his mother's, a man's work glove that smelled of the particular mixture of leather oil and tobacco that working men carried with them, and most conclusively, a small Bible with Joseph Fletcher, Independence, Missouri, written in careful script on the inside cover. "They got away, didn't they?" Tommy asked, his young voice carrying desperate hope. Sam nodded firmly, then helped Tommy back onto Bell. They followed the survivors' trail carefully, Sam's senses alert for any sign of the Apache raiders who might still be in the area. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they climbed toward the hills, the rocky terrain becoming increasingly treacherous for Bell's hooves. The trail led through a narrow canyon that wound between towering red stone walls, creating a natural corridor that would be easily defensible, but potentially deadly if enemies controlled the high ground. Sam's military instincts, honed during his service in the war between the states, automatically assessed the tactical situation. If the wagon train survivors had reached the hills and found a defensible position, they might hold out indefinitely. If they'd been caught in the open, however, their situation would be desperate. As they approached the base of the hills, a rifle shot rang out, echoing off the stone walls like thunder. Sam immediately reined Bell to a halt, raising his hands to show he carried no weapons and meant no harm. A man's voice called out from somewhere among the rocks above them. "That's far enough, stranger. State your business." Sam looked at Tommy and nodded encouragingly. The boy took a deep breath and called out in his clear, young voice, "Papa, Papa, it's me, Tommy. I'm here." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then, from somewhere in the rocks above, came a cry of joy and disbelief that echoed across the hills like a prayer answered. "Tommy? Tommy? Is that really you?" A man emerged from behind a large boulder, rifle in hand but pointing safely toward the ground. Joseph Fletcher was a tall, lean man in his 30s, his face gaunt with worry and exhaustion, but now transformed by overwhelming relief. Behind him came other survivors, women clutching children, men with the hollow-eyed look of people who had seen too much violence, all of them staring at the miraculous sight of the lost child they had given up for dead. Tommy slid down from Belle's back and ran toward his father, who dropped his rifle and swept the boy up in an embrace that spoke of a parent's worst nightmare finally ending. The reunion was emotional beyond words, with tears flowing freely among all the survivors, who had spent the previous day and night believing they had failed to protect one of their own. "Thank God," Joseph Fletcher whispered, holding his son as if he might disappear again. "Thank God you're alive. We searched for you until the Apache came, and then—" His voice broke with the memory of the impossible choice between searching for his lost son and protecting the rest of his family. Sam dismounted and stood quietly to one side, uncomfortable with the emotional display, but understanding its necessity. Other survivors approached him with expressions of gratitude and curiosity, wondering who this silent stranger was and how he had managed to find their lost child in the vastness of the desert. "This man saved me, Papa," Tommy said, pulling away from his father's embrace to gesture toward Sam. "He found me under a tree, and he gave me water, and he knew how to follow the trail to find you." Joseph Fletcher approached Sam with his hand extended, his eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you. Tommy's all we got left of ... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge the loss of everything they had worked for. Sam shook the offered hand and nodded toward the group of survivors, making gestures that asked about their situation and immediate needs. Even without words, his meaning was clear. The reunion was joyful, but they were all still in considerable danger. An older woman, gray-haired and dignified, despite her torn dress and dirt-streaked face, stepped forward. "I'm Martha Henderson," she said. "We're what's left of the Fletcher-Henderson wagon train. 15 souls, counting the children. We lost everything except what we could carry, but we're alive. And now ... She looked at Tommy with wonder. "Now we're whole again." Sam gestured toward the canyon entrance, then made a cutting motion across his throat, indicating that their current position, while defensible, was also a trap if enemies controlled the exit. The survivors understood immediately. They needed to move, and soon before the Apache returned with reinforcements or simply decided to wait them out. "Can you guide us out of here?" Joseph Fletcher asked. "We don't know this country, and without our wagons, we're lost." Sam nodded firmly, already planning a route that would take them away from the immediate danger while heading toward the nearest settlement. But first, they needed to tend to immediate needs: water, food, and medical attention for those who had been injured in the attack. The real journey was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Escape Dawn broke gray and uncertain over the rocky fortress where the survivors had spent a sleepless night. Sam had spent the dark hours moving silently among the group, assessing their condition and capabilities with the methodical thoroughness of a man whose life had often depended on such evaluations. What he found was both encouraging and troubling. The 15 survivors consisted of 3 families plus 2 single men who had joined the wagon train for protection during the journey west. Martha Henderson, The gray-haired woman who seemed to serve as the group's unofficial leader traveled with her adult daughter and 2 grandchildren. The Fletchers, Joseph, his wife Sarah, and Tommy, represented the largest family group. The Kowalski family, recent immigrants from Poland, spoke limited English but demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of catastrophe. Sam's greatest concern was Sarah Fletcher, Tommy's mother, who had been fighting consumption since before. The journey began. The stress and hardship of the Apache attack had worsened her condition dramatically, leaving her barely able to walk and coughing up blood with increasing frequency. Joseph's face carried the hollow look of a man watching his wife slip away, while trying to hold his family together. "She needs a doctor," Joseph whispered to Sam as they stood beside Sarah's makeshift bed of blankets and saddlebags. "Real medicine, not just the tonics we've been giving her." Sam nodded grimly and drew a rough map in the dirt, showing their current position relative to the nearest town. Tucson was 4 days away on foot through dangerous territory, but it offered their best hope for medical care and supplies. Closer settlements were little more than trading posts with no medical facilities. The decision to move was made for them. When young Billy Henderson, Martha's 12-year-old grandson, spotted dust clouds on the horizon, Apache scouts were returning, probably with reinforcements. Sam gathered the group leaders and laid out their options with gesture and crude drawings in the sand. They could try to defend their current position, but they had limited ammunition and no source of water except what they carried. They could attempt to reach Tucson, but the journey would be grueling, and Sarah Fletcher might not survive it. Or they could head for a smaller settlement called Agua Caliente, 2 days away, where they might find temporary safety and basic supplies. "Do you think?" Martha Henderson asked, her weathered face showing the strain of leadership thrust upon her by circumstance. Sam pointed toward Agua Caliente on his crude map, then made gestures indicating that it offered their best compromise between safety and Sarah's urgent medical needs. The settlement was built around a natural spring and had a small garrison of territorial militia who could provide protection while they planned their next move. The preparation for departure was heartbreaking to witness. Families sorted through their remaining possessions, choosing what to carry and what to abandon forever. Children's toys were left behind to make room for water and food. Family heirlooms that had survived the journey from distant homes were discarded to save weight that might mean the difference between life and death. Tommy approached Sam while the adults were making their final preparations, carrying the wooden horse toy that Sam had found by the creek. "Mr. Sam," he said quietly, "I want you to have this. You saved my life, and Papa says a man should always repay his debts." Sam knelt beside the boy and gently pushed the toy back into Tommy's hands, shaking his head with a slight smile. Through gestures, he made it clear that the boy's safety and reunion with his family was payment enough for any service he might have rendered. "Will you stay with us?" Tommy asked, his young face serious with the weight of recent events. "Will you help us get to California?" The question caught Sam off guard. He had planned to guide them to safety and then return to his solitary existence. But looking at the boy's hopeful expression and seeing the trust in the faces of the other survivors, he realized that some responsibilities, once accepted, could not be easily abandoned. Sam nodded slowly, committing himself to a journey he had never planned to take and a future he had never imagined. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that solid ground would appear beneath his feet. The escape from the rocky hills required careful timing and considerable luck. Sam led them through a narrow ravine that wound away from their defensive position, using natural cover to mask their movement from the Apache scouts, who were undoubtedly watching for any sign of activity. Sarah Fletcher had to be carried on a makeshift stretcher, slowing their progress but making silent movement impossible They had traveled less than a mile when the sound of gunfire echoed from the direction of their abandoned camp. The Apache had discovered their departure and were expressing their frustration in the traditional manner. Sam urged the group to move faster, knowing that pursuit would not be long in coming. The first day of travel tested everyone's endurance to the breaking point. The desert heat was merciless, and their limited water supply had to be carefully rationed among 15 people, including 4 children under the age of 10. By evening, when they reached a small oasis where Sam had planned to make camp, several of the adults were showing signs of heat exhaustion, but they had gained valuable time and distance from their pursuers. More importantly, they had proven to themselves that they could work together as a group, following Sam's silent leadership and supporting their weakest members without complaint or recrimination. As they settled in for another sleepless night, Tommy approached Sam again. "Are we going to make it?" he asked quietly. Sam looked at the boy's serious face, then at the circle of exhausted survivors who had entrusted their lives to his guidance. He nodded firmly, projecting a confidence he didn't entirely feel, but knowing that leadership sometimes meant appearing certain when certainty was impossible. They would make it because they had to. Because Tommy deserved to see his mother recover and his family reach the promised land of California. Because Martha Henderson's grandchildren deserved a chance to grow up in safety. Because sometimes, when everything else was stripped away, the simple determination to survive and protect others was enough to carry people through impossible circumstances. But Sam also knew that the hardest part of their journey still lay ahead, and that survival would require more than determination. It would require sacrifice, courage, and perhaps a kind of hope that he had almost forgotten how to feel. Chapter 5. The settlement Agua Caliente appeared, like a mirage shimmering in the desert heat. Its adobe buildings and green cottonwood trees offering the promise of water, shade, and temporary respite from the endless struggle for survival. The settlement was larger than Sam had expected, with perhaps 50 buildings clustered around. The natural spring that gave the town its name. Most importantly, he could see the territorial flag flying over what appeared to be a small military outpost. The arrival of 15 bedraggled survivors caused quite a stir among the townspeople. Children ran alongside their group as they made their way toward the town center, while adults emerged from shops and houses to stare at the refugees with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Word of their approach had apparently preceded them, because a man wearing a badge and carrying a rifle was waiting for them in front of the largest building in town. "I'm Sheriff Martinez," the man said, his accent revealing Spanish heritage, but his English clear and precise. "Heard you folks had some trouble with Apaches. You're welcome in Agua Caliente, but I need to know your intentions and how long you plan to stay." Sam let Joseph Fletcher speak for the group, understanding that the settlers would be more comfortable dealing with someone who could actually voice their needs and concerns. Joseph explained their circumstances briefly, emphasizing Sarah's deteriorating health and their need for medical attention and supplies. "We've got a doctor here," Sheriff Martinez said, his stern expression softening as he looked at Sarah Fletcher's pale, drawn face. "Doc Williams served with the Army before settling here. He's seen consumption before." He gestured toward a nearby building. "Get her inside out of this heat, and we'll see what we can do." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Dr. Williams, a graying man with gentle hands and kind eyes, examined Sarah thoroughly while the other survivors were given water, food, and places to rest. Tommy stayed close to Sam, as if afraid that his savior might disappear if he let him out of sight for too long. Sam found himself the object of considerable curiosity among the townspeople. His silence was interpreted by some as mysterious, by others as hostile, until Tommy began telling anyone who would listen about how the quiet cowboy had saved him from the desert and guided his family to safety. Word spread quickly through the small community, and Sam's status shifted from suspicious stranger to local hero with remarkable speed. "The boy's mother is very sick," Dr. Williams told the group that evening as they gathered in the town's small church for a meal provided by the generous residents. "The consumption has advanced significantly, and the stress of recent events hasn't helped. She needs complete rest, proper nutrition, and medication that I can provide. But—" He paused, looking uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "How long?" Joseph Fletcher asked quietly, his face grave with the knowledge of what the doctors' hesitation meant. "With proper care, maybe 6 months. Maybe longer if we're fortunate. But the journey to California, especially in her current condition—" Dr. Williams shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry, Joseph. I wish I had better news." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that everyone understood, but no one wanted to voice. Sarah Fletcher's dream of reaching California and building a new life for her family was effectively over. The question now was whether she would live to see Tommy grow into manhood. Regardless of where that growth took place, Sam watched the family struggle with this devastating news, feeling helpless. In the face of an enemy he couldn't fight with courage or determination. But as he observed the interaction between Joseph, Sarah, and Tommy, he began to see something that gave him hope. The love between them was so strong, so evident in every glance and gesture, that it seemed to create its own kind of strength. Night, unable to sleep, Sam walked through the quiet streets of Agua Caliente, thinking about the choices that lay ahead. The original plan had been to guide the survivors to safety, and then return to his solitary existence. But circumstances had changed everything. These people needed him, not just for his knowledge of the frontier, but for the stability and purpose. His presence seemed to provide. Tommy found him sitting by the spring that gave the town its name, staring up at the stars that blazed overhead with desert clarity. "Mr. Sam," the boy said quietly, settling down beside him, "Papa says Mama might not get better. Says we might have to stay here instead of going to California." Sam nodded, understanding the boy's confusion and disappointment. Through gestures and simple drawings in the dirt, he tried to explain that sometimes life forced people to change their plans, but that didn't mean giving up on happiness or hope. "Will you stay with us if we stay here?" Tommy asked, his young voice carrying all the uncertainty of a child whose world had been turned upside down multiple times in recent days. Sam looked at the boy's earnest face, illuminated by starlight and the glow from nearby windows where other families were settling in for the night. The question demanded an answer that would shape not just Tommy's future, but his own. For 8 years, Sam had convinced himself that isolation was preferable to the pain of caring about other people, and potentially losing them. But Tommy's simple question forced him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding, that isolation wasn't protection. It was just another form of dying. Sam nodded firmly, placing a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder in a gesture that promised more than words could have conveyed. Whatever came next, whatever decisions the Fletcher family made about their future, Sam would be there to help them face it. He had found something in this group of survivors that he hadn't even realized he'd been searching for, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of family that transcended blood relationships. "I'm glad," Tommy said simply, leaning against Sam's solid presence. "I was scared you'd leave like everybody else leaves eventually." Sam understood that Tommy's fear came from experiences that no 8-year-old should have to endure. The loss of home, possessions, security, and now the potential loss of his mother. But as they sat together by the spring, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, Sam made a silent promise that this child would never again have to face the terror of abandonment. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet imagine, and losses they might not be able to prevent. But they would face whatever came together, as a family forged not by blood, but by the bonds of mutual dependence, shared hardship, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure rather than breaking beneath it. Chapter 6. The Decision 3. Weeks passed in Agua Caliente, and the small community had gradually absorbed the wagon train survivors into its daily rhythm. Some of the refugees had already made plans to move on. The Kowalski family intended to continue to California once. They had earned enough money for supplies, and one of the single men had found work with a rancher heading to New Mexico. But the Fletcher family remained in limbo, caught between Sarah's deteriorating health and Joseph's desperate desire to fulfill his promise of a new life in California. Sam had found work with the local blacksmith, his strong hands and intuitive understanding of metalwork making him valuable, despite his inability to engage in the casual conversation that normally accompanied such labor. The townspeople had grown accustomed to his silence, and children, like Tommy, often served as his interpreters when complex communication was necessary. The arrangement suited everyone involved, but Sam could see the strain it was placing on the Fletcher family. Joseph struggled with the knowledge that staying in Agua Caliente meant abandoning the dream that had sustained them through months of hardship, while Sarah battled not just her illness, but the guilt of believing she was holding her family back from their destiny. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning when Sarah collapsed while hanging laundry behind the small house they had been sharing with Martha Henderson's family. Dr. Williams was summoned immediately, and after a lengthy examination, he emerged with a grave expression that had become all too familiar. "She's taken a serious turn for the worse," he told Joseph privately, though Sam, standing nearby, could read the implications in the doctor's body language. "The consumption has spread to both lungs now. I'd say we're looking at weeks, maybe a month or two at the outside." Joseph Fletcher aged a decade in the span of that conversation. Sam watched as the weight of impending loss settled on the man's shoulders like a physical burden, bowing his head and stealing the light from his eyes. But what concerned Sam most was Tommy's reaction to his father's obvious distress. The boy had become increasingly clingy and fearful, as if he sensed that the fragile stability they had found in Agua Caliente was about to be shattered once again. That evening, as the family gathered around Sarah's bedside, she made an announcement. That surprised everyone. "Joseph," she said, her voice weak but determined, "I want you to take Tommy and go to California. Don't waste what time I have left sitting here watching me die." "Sarah, no," Joseph protested, his voice breaking with emotion. "I won't leave you. We're a family, and families stay together." "Families do what's best for each other," Sarah replied firmly, displaying the strength of will that had carried her through months of illness and hardship. "Tommy needs a future, and that future isn't in this little settlement watching his mother waste away. California was our dream, Joseph. Don't let my sickness kill that dream too." Sam understood the logic of Sarah's argument, but he also recognized the impossible position it put Joseph in. No man wanted to abandon his dying wife, regardless of the nobility of her motives. And Tommy, despite his youth, was old enough to understand that leaving Agua Caliente would mean saying goodbye to his mother forever. The debate continued for several days, with Martha Henderson and Dr. Williams both offering their perspectives on what would be best for the family. But it was Tommy himself who finally provided the solution. In the innocent way that children sometimes cut through adult complications to reach the heart of an issue. "Why can't Mama come with us?" he asked one evening as the adults discussed the situation in hushed tones. "If she's gonna die anyway, why can't she die in California where she always wanted to be?" The adults exchanged glances, recognizing the simple wisdom in the boy's question. Dr. Williams had said Sarah had weeks, maybe 2 months at the outside. The journey to California would take perhaps a month under the best conditions. longer if they traveled slowly to accommodate her condition. It was possible. Difficult and dangerous, but possible. It would be very hard on her, Dr. Williams said carefully. The travel, the heat, the lack of proper medical care along the way. It could actually shorten the time she has left. But it would give her the chance to see the place she's been dreaming about, Martha Henderson added quietly. Sometimes dying with your dreams fulfilled is better than dying safe but disappointed. Sam found himself drawn into the conversation, despite his usual preference for observing rather than participating. Through gestures and simple drawings, he outlined a possible route it would take them to California via a longer but less strenuous path. There were settlements along the way where they could rest and resupply, and the autumn weather would be more manageable than the summer heat they had endured. But more importantly, Sam offered something that made the impossible seem merely difficult. He would guide them personally, using his knowledge of the territory to find water, avoid hostile tribes, and navigate the challenges that had defeated less experienced travelers. His commitment to their welfare had grown beyond mere duty into something approaching devotion, particularly to Tommy, who had become like a son to him. "You would do that?" Joseph asked, his eyes bright with hope for the first time in weeks. "You'd leave your life here to help us reach California?" Sam nodded without hesitation, understanding that his life in Agua Caliente had been merely a temporary pause in a journey he hadn't realized he was still taking. His real purpose, the reason fate had placed him in Tommy's path that day in the desert, was to see this family safely to their destination, regardless of what that journey might cost him personally. Sarah Fletcher, despite her weakness, smiled, with genuine joy at the prospect of continuing toward the dream that had sustained her through so much hardship. "Then we'll go," she said simply. "We'll go to California together, and whatever happens, happens. At least Tommy will have the chance to see the place his parents believed was worth any sacrifice to reach." The decision, once made, brought a sense of peace to the family that had been missing since the Apache attack. They would face the future together, accepting whatever outcome awaited them, but refusing to surrender their dreams to fear or despair. And Sam, the silent guardian who had become their anchor in a world of constant change, would be with them every step of the way. Chapter 7. The promise of tomorrow. The morning of their departure from Agua Caliente dawned clear and cool, with the promise of winter beginning to soften the harsh edges of the desert landscape. Sam had spent the previous week carefully planning their route and gathering supplies, using his wages from the blacksmith to purchase a sturdy wagon and gentle horses suitable for Sarah's condition. The townspeople, who had grown fond of the Fletcher family during their stay, contributed food, blankets, and medical supplies that Dr. Williams thought might prove useful during the journey. Sarah Fletcher looked fragile but determined as Sam helped her into the wagon bed that he had padded with every soft material he could find. The journey ahead would test her remaining strength to its limits, but the spark of anticipation in her eyes suggested that the hope of reaching California was providing its own form of medicine. Tommy rode beside Sam on the wagon seat, chattering with excitement about the adventure ahead while trying to mask his concern for his mother's condition. Joseph Fletcher rode alongside on horseback, having traded his remaining possessions for a dependable mount that would allow him to scout ahead and hunt for fresh meat to supplement their supplies. Their route would take them through the southern corridor that avoided the worst of the mountain passes while still heading generally westward toward the coast. Sam had chosen this path not just for its accessibility, but because it passed through several settlements where they could rest and seek medical attention if Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. The first week of travel tested everyone's endurance, but not in the ways they had expected. Sarah's condition remained stable, and the cool autumn weather made traveling more comfortable than their previous desert ordeal. The real challenge came from the emotional intensity of knowing that every mile might be bringing them closer to. Their dreams while simultaneously counting down Sarah's remaining time, Tommy proved to be remarkably adaptable, serving as interpreter for Sam's silent communications and helping with camp duties that would have been beyond his abilities just months earlier. The hardship of their journey had matured him in ways that both impressed and saddened the adults who watched him shoulder responsibilities that no child should have to bear. Joseph Fletcher struggled most with the psychological aspects of their situation. His wife was dying, his son was growing up too fast, and his own dreams of establishing a successful farm in California seemed increasingly impossible given their limited resources and Sarah's declining health. But Sam's steady presence and unwavering commitment to their welfare provided the stability that kept Joseph from succumbing to despair. As they traveled, Sarah began sharing stories of her childhood and dreams for Tommy's future with an urgency that suggested she understood how limited her time for such conversations might be. Sam listened to these intimate family moments from his position on the wagon seat, feeling privileged to witness the love that bound the Fletcher family together, even in the face of approaching loss. 3 weeks into their journey, they reached a trading post called Riverside Station, where the proprietor informed them that they were now less than 2 weeks from the California border. The news energized the entire group, but it was Sarah's reaction that moved Sam most deeply. Despite her obvious weakness, she insisted on getting out of the wagon to stand on the ground and look westward toward the mountains that marked their destination. "I can smell it," she said quietly, her voice barely audible but filled with wonder. "I can smell the ocean and the orange groves and all the promise that's waiting for us there." Whether she could actually smell anything other than desert sage and dust was irrelevant. Her faith in the dream they were pursuing was so strong that it seemed to create its own reality. Tommy approached Sam that evening as they made camp, his young face serious with questions he had been pondering for days. "Mr. Sam," he said quietly, "what's going to happen when we get to California? What's going to happen when Mama ... He couldn't finish the sentence, but Sam understood what he was asking. Sam knelt beside the boy and drew pictures in the dirt, showing a man and a boy working together, building something permanent and lasting. Through gestures and expressions, he conveyed a promise that went beyond words, that whatever happened to Sarah, Tommy would never be alone, never be without someone who cared about his welfare and his future. "You'd really stay with us?" Tommy asked, his eyes bright with hope and unshed tears. "You'd really be like my uncle or something?" Sam nodded firmly, understanding that his commitment to this family had evolved beyond duty or even friendship into something approaching paternal love. Tommy had filled a hole in his heart that he hadn't even realized existed, and the thought of walking away from the boy now was unthinkable. The final week of their journey passed like a dream, with each day bringing new wonders that spoke of California's promise. The air grew softer and more humid, carrying scents of vegetation and possibilities that none of them had experienced before. When they finally crested the last hill and saw the Pacific Ocean spreading endlessly toward the horizon, Sarah Fletcher wept with joy at having lived to witness the fulfillment of her family's greatest dream. They settled in a small coastal town, where the mild climate and supportive community provided exactly the environment Sarah needed for her final weeks. She lived long enough to see Tommy enrolled in the local school, to help Joseph plan the small farm they would establish with Sam's help, and to witness the bond between Sam and her son deepen into the kind of relationship that would sustain Tommy through whatever challenges lay ahead. When Sarah Fletcher finally passed on a quiet December morning, surrounded by her family and watching the sunrise paint the Pacific in shades of gold and rose, she died knowing that her sacrifice had achieved its purpose. Tommy would grow up in the land of promise she had envisioned, under the protection of a man who had proven his devotion through actions rather than words. Sam McKinnon. the silent cowboy who had rescued a lost child and found his own redemption. In the process, stood beside Tommy's bed that night as the boy grieved for his mother. Without words, but with the quiet strength that had carried them all through impossible circumstances, he conveyed a promise that would shape both their futures, that some families are chosen rather than born, and that the bonds forged in hardship can be stronger than any created by blood alone. The desert had taken much from all of them, but it had also given them something precious, the knowledge that hope, courage, and love could triumph over any obstacle, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with dramatic gestures, but with the simple decision to care about someone else's welfare more than your own safety. In the end, that was the legacy Sarah Fletcher left her son. Not just the dream of California, but the understanding that dreams are only worth pursuing when they're shared with people who matter more than the eye. Destination itself. Asterisk, asterisk. If this story of hope, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds formed in adversity touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more tales from the American frontier. Share in the comments what dreams you're willing to fight for. Your stories inspire the next chapter of our journey together. Asterisk, asterisk.